qualifications for today's lecture. He completed his undergraduate work at Tufts College in Boston. He received his master's degree from the University of Michigan and was recently awarded an honorary doctorate of literature from his alma mater. Among his many, many publications are the books Other Skies, Live Another Day, As If, and How Does a Poem Mean? Many of you who have enrolled in the Augsburg class entitled Literature of the Western World have read Professor Ciardi's translation of Dante's Inferno. He has been widely recognized in academic circles. He is a former assistant professor of English at Harvard and professor of English at Rutgers University. He is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and of the National Institute of Arts and Letters. He is a past president of the National College English Association and is presently the director of the Breadloaf Writers Association. Some of you may be interested to know that the Breadloaf Writers Association takes its name from Breadloaf Mountain rather than food. But even though he has rare academic achievements, Professor Ciardi has succeeded in expressing himself to the American public with both wit and plain sense. His experience with poetry both as a poet and as a critic gives him a particularly authoritative position to speak about poetry. He is perhaps best known to the American public as poetry editor of the Saturday Review and as the host of the CBS television program Accent. Professor Ciardi, we welcome you to our campus and we eagerly await your discussion of the topic, How Does a Poem Mean?
Gentlemen, thank you, Mr. Holt, for a more than generous introduction. For a while I thought you had the beauty queens here now. I almost sound like a candidate. I'm grateful. I don't get that experience often. Actually, it's a strange business trying to get poetry in the classroom together. I wish it were illegal to read poetry. I wish you had to smuggle it. Because I think I've tried to teach this stuff. I'm schizophrenic. With one head I try to write it. With the other I've tried to teach it. And I'm always aware of doing a certain violence to one impulse and trying to communicate the other. You know, ask yourself, how does a poem come into being? There are a lot of fancy answers possible, but I think the basic process of writing a poem is the fact that a man who has learned the medium of it, as a man has learned to play the violin, for example, gets mortally itchy and has to scratch it. It's basically that. I think there's a lot of bad poetry written nowadays in which people are scratching a non-existent itch, or at least they're scratching something produced by itching powder rather than by a real human skin of itself. But just being human is cause enough to move into the areas that are quickened by poetry and that quicken poetry. Yet let's say a man comes to some midnight of his life and for some reason, whatever, he writes a poem. He's in love. So he writes a poem. Let's say it's a poem about his wife or about somebody else's wife. That happens too. It's that's where all the footnotes come into the sophomore survey course. At any rate, this poem is written in some sort of human excitement. Now, the night he writes it, it's all covered with hen scratchings and his own thumb smudges, and he doodles in the margin, and he crosses this out and writes it. And the next morning, he awakens to a colder and a bleaker world, and he looks at the poem, and he's not entirely appalled. He sees some things he has to change, so he keeps working at it. And a week later, or 2 weeks later, or a month later, he has returned to it a number of times. He puts it away for a cooling off period because he's afraid to let it out just first batch. Words turn around on the page if you're not careful. You have to get some distance from what you've written before you know what you've written. But at any rate, let's say in 2 months or 3 or 4, he has been back to it a number of times in different contexts, and he takes a chance and types it out. and already it has lost all these squiggles and things he has put to it, and sends it to a magazine. And let's say the magazine buys it. He then gets some proof sheets back, and now it no longer looks like his at all. You see, it's set up in somebody else's type on a different piece of paper, and he checks the galleys and maybe makes a change or two as this new thing appears to him. And a while later it appears in the magazine, sometimes in very interesting contexts. I had a poem once appear between an ad for Maidenform Bra and Camay soap. And that is not what I had in mind when I first wrote it. At least not the Camay, but the. Well, it's one of the subjects of poetry. But at any rate, here is the poem, and it has grown distant from him. It no longer has his particular impress on it, you see. And, let's say 2 years later, he decides to put it into a book. And 4 years later, it gets into an anthology. And 15 years later, it shows up in a textbook. And at 9 o'clock in the morning, you walk into class, and you're responsible for it on the final examination, and that's somehow just too far from where it started. The excitement, the urgency that began the poem is one thing, and this, let's get this poem cold because he might ask about it on a quiz or on the final examination, is another. Nobody writes poems in order to talk about them on final examinations. I don't see how you can treat it in the schoolroom without that, but I think the schoolroom owes this apology to the human impulse, and the wise teacher makes it implicitly in everything he says. It is a human process. It's about as natural as a human process gets. And I'm concerned with one particular problem. My last 2 years as a teacher, before I gave up, and actually, I was getting so busy I was cheating it. I was stealing too much time from my students to work on my own things. And then when I did have to grade a set of papers, I'd find myself thinking, why am I working on this manuscript when I have my own to work on, and mine's better? So bit by bit, I just gave up in order to get my work done. But in the course of these years of teaching, I found myself drifting over into the School of Education. Because the last 2 years I taught were in the School of Education, because I found myself interested in what is it that destroys this pleasure in poetry that a child begins with. Every child has it. Children are the most wonderful audience for poetry that I've ever met. I've been doing a lot of children's verse the last few years, more than a few years. My wife sort of filled the house up with kids, and this was one of the ways of playing with them. It became a delightful game, and then I found myself talking to, say, third grade kids in classrooms. And they are a wonderful, natural, sparkling audience for poetry. They can't take complex poetry or terribly complicated poetry, but they go with it immediately. They dance to it. My son came home from first grade class one day, and he had just learned a little poem. And it ran, I rake the leaves up in a hump, and then I bend my knees and jump. And he came jumping into the house, and that was fine. He jumped upstairs, and he was sort of hypnotized by this poem and by having that thing to do. And after a while, he jumped upstairs, and his room happens to be over the dining room, and we have a rather flimsy chandelier hanging there that began to sway perilously, and I had to go upstairs and kill his poetic impulse, or at least urge him to take it outdoors. But he was just happily going along with the thing. I think that if I am right in my thesis, now you go to a third grade classroom and you have a marvelous audience for poetry. You go to a high school classroom and you have a lousy audience for poetry. And what has happened in between? Is the school system a plot to destroy love of poetry? It seems to work out that way. Well, maybe part of it is the school system's fault, but I think part of it starts outside the school system. Checking back on my own experience, I can see several reasons for this going. In the first place, I think the school system peddles some terribly bad poetry for patriotic reasons. It's an American school system, therefore let us teach American poetry. So we dip into the 19th century and we teach as major poets a lot of people who just happen to be American poets. Had they been writing in England, we would probably never have heard of them. I don't mean to be an assassin of literary reputations, but who would have paid much attention to Edgar Allan Poe had he been writing in London? There's some passages, but compared to Tennyson, Shelley and Keats, Byron, and others along this way, I don't think he's in the competition. The Lowells and James Whitcomb Riley and Longfellow, there are a few nice things of Longfellow's, but oh, that dreadful Evangeline. It seemed to me a silly poem. It seemed to me silly in just the same way the teacher was silly. I distrusted both of them. She told me this was beautiful stuff. And when I began a poem that said, I shot an arrow into the air, it fell to earth, I know not where, all I could think of was that's a damn careless way of playing. And certainly I mean to honor the student who asks that kind of question. You're not supposed to shut your mind off when you enter a poem. You're supposed to bring your living experience to it, to be measured, to get some sense of what that experience is. And I think the 19th century has a lot of silly poetry in that way. I can't find myself very well persuaded by strike till the last armed foe expires, strike for the green graves of your sires, strike for your altars and your fires, God and your native rhetoric. And, it's a little too big. It sounds phony to me. It sounds like a political speaker, or sometimes like a colonel. I spent some years in the Army, and I think the deadest sounds given off by the human mind are invariably given off by colonels. If some one of your faculty members happen to have been a colonel, I'll say there are exceptions. But as a generalization, I will let it stand. Well, that's one of the things. I think kids are marvelously adept at spotting what is phony. It's a mistake to think you can fool them for long. They'll just react away from it. Another thing is, like it or not, American boys seem to worry about being sissies. They don't worry about being Australian Aborigines, and they don't worry about being Eskimos. And I assume they don't worry about that because there's no chance of there being one of those. But maybe it's the frontier legend of America. Or maybe it's the practicality legend of America. Or maybe everybody is supposed to be a psychic Texan. But somehow or another, boys do worry about this. I recall worrying about it. And all I can give you from my vantage point of my many, many years is one wry reflection. The boys grow up, they get married, they discover that they really are sissies and that it doesn't make any difference. That's the way it's supposed to be. But for a while, it is a problem. And I think it has this to do with the teaching of poetry. There are many good poems that should not be fed to American boys. They should be left till later. And the school system needs to do a careful job of evaluating this thing. A perfectly good poem, a poem I like, beginning, I wandered lonely as a cloud. Well, what's that going to do for the boys? There are times when they feel that way, but they're a little uncomfortable on this thing. Or there's a grand poem by Keats beginning, I stood tiptoe on a little hill. Now, American boys do not go around standing tiptoe on little hills. As a matter of fact, they tend to be suspicious of people who do go around that way. Now, there is nothing wrong with that as a poem. But begin the poem, and where are the boys? They've left. Their bodies are behind, but their minds have gone somewhere else. And they're drawing back from poetry. Or give them Shelley's Indian Serenade. I awake from dreams of thee, sweet as the night air, and he wanders to the window and outside, and I faint, I fall, oh, lift me from the grass. And that's said to his girlfriend in a reverie, of course. And supposing some boy was shrewd enough to think, now, what would his girlfriend have to look like, That's one of the, I like to see students think about the facts of a poem. Or where are the boys when Shelley says, I faint, I fall, I tremble, I expire? That's another un-American gesture. Well, it's up to the school system to see to it, really, that there are plenty of good poems. Plenty of good poems that could engage boys as acts of reality. I wish the school system would junk most of the 19th century poetry it is now teaching and pick it very carefully with this in mind. There are good poems, not bad ones, and then say, granted this is a good poem, does it contain in it elements that are going to run into a psychic block in a boy's system? I wish they'd start with, say, Hardy's Satires of Circumstance, where the little dramatic plot is intriguing. And then maybe go to Edwin Arlington Robinson for Minovicevi and for Richard Corey and Cliff Klingenhagen, and some of these human situations have a little story in them. Then bit by bit you sneak up on more subtle situations in the poem, and you'll find that once you start this way, you've got enthusiasm going. Because it's impossible not to be enthusiastic about these poems if you'll just listen. They're about realities, and they're happy experiences of realities. You know that this poetry is about life. It's not about some nebulous cloud. Then later, when you're more adjusted, you can tolerate nebulous clouds, and it's just a matter of progression into the form. Children have this immediately, as I say. They read a poem, and it's a reality. It's something happening. But that's one sin of the school system, it seems to me, and you can check it on your own. I recall one of the first poems I was required to memorize, my first year in high school. It happened to be the first poem in Palgrave's Golden Treasury, as it was then constituted. And this is just bad teaching. It was, spring, sweet spring, is the year's pleasant king. Then pretty bird, then maids dance in a ring. Then pretty birds do sing, cuckoo, jug, jug, poo-wee, to wit a woo. Now, had that, even that, had it been taught with some intelligence, would have scored. Because I was in graduate school before I discovered that this was not really a poem in itself, it was the lyrics to a song. And sung to a musical accompaniment with the right cadence and so forth, it would go. Had the teacher just told me that all this cuckoo, jug, jug stuff was an Elizabethan Hutsut Ralston on a Rilla-Raw, I would at least have known how to take it, but all I was told was, this is beautiful, memorize it. Oh, well, I memorized it all right, but I couldn't tell it to any of my friends, not out of class. On the other hand, we used to quote Kipling to one another or read Kipling back and forth, along with some bad stuff, Casey at the Bat and Dangerous Dan McGrew and so forth. Those seemed lively and entertaining poems. Well, that's one fault of the school system, and I suspect that another is over-rationality. You see, that dark 9 o'clock in the morning, where you're supposed to make sense of everything with a capital S. It's a terrible term. Make sense of it. How do you make sense of the dream you had last night? It just haunts you. But the teachers still are too fond of paraphrase. The instructions with which I used to get poetry were, in 2 good English sentences or 3 good English sentences that make sense, state the meaning of this poem. I sometimes think it said, state the by God meaning of this poem, bang, down on the that overemphasis. And it was an act of translation, wasn't it? You were asked to translate this poem into a language called sense, a language known to the school system. The way the poet would have written it in the first place had he been as smart as the school system. Well, what disappears when you have paraphrase? That's really translation. Robert Frost said poetry is what disappears in translation. Now, the fault in this is not that paraphrase is intrinsically bad, so long as the teacher will carry one thing in mind. The thing is that once the paraphrase has been completed, you still have all of the poem to go. Because the poem is not contained in its subject matter. It's contained in the management of the subject matter. Let me see if I can make that point. Begin it this way. It is not absolutely essential for a poem to mean anything. You start message hunting it relentlessly for meaning and you destroy it. One of the worst things you could say of a poet was said by a science fiction writer once. His remark was, he sold his birthright for a pot of message. It'll take a little thinking about it. So he sold his birthright for a pot of message. Now, a poet is not a deliverer of messages in this sense. He's not a politician. He's not a minister. He's not a superintendent of schools. He's not necessarily required to be respectable. He's performing an act of language. Robert Penn Warren, a few years back, said a thing you might do well to think about. Poetry begins by giving form to an experience, and it ends as the experience of a form. Experience is the measure, and I want to return to that in a minute. But what happens when you're given a poem to paraphrase? Let's start with my claim that a poem need not mean anything. There's a lovely piece by David McCord that runs about this way. Big Chief Wattapotamai sat in the shade, sat in the sun and said, me hot am I. Sat in the shade and said, me cooler. Such is the life of an Indian ruler. Well, what's the meaning of that? It's not about Indians. It's not about the relative temperature in and out of the shade. It's not any one of those things, and yet there's a little form to experience in it. It's not a profound poem. You're not going to live your lives by it, but there's enough containment so that you have a pleasant reaction to it. You've experienced a shape of language, and shape is pleasurable. Or you go a step further. There's a poem by Margaret Fishback I like. It's one of the longest poems in the English language. It runs, you get the idea. Oh, somewhere there are people who have nothing in the world to do but sit upon the Pyrenees and use the very special breeze provided for the people who have nothing in the world to do but sit upon the Pyrenees and use the very special breeze provided for the people who have nothing in the world to do, and you go on as long as you like. That's a lovely stunt. What does it mean? It's not about the Pyrenees, it's not about people, it's not about breezes. Back in the 30s, there was a strange communist critic who argued once that this was a satire on the exploitation of the proletariat by the capitalists. You see. You see how it goes? Oh, somewhere there are people who have nothing in the world to do, the economic royalists, but sit upon the Pyrenees, their money bags, and use the very special breeze, class privilege. Well, Margaret Fishback would have had a stroke if she'd thought she was writing that, you see. That was just his perversion of the thing. What it is something more nearly like my son's pleasure in jumping around. It's like a home run. You know, you cannot hit home runs for God. You just hit home runs for their own sake. I think Tennyson made the mistake of trying to score home runs for God or for Queen Victoria instead of for the pleasure of batting the ball out of the park. It's just the best thing you can do under the circumstances. And there are all kinds of home runs. One of my favorite sluggers occurs in the Chanson de Roland, the medieval French epic of Charlemagne. Roland, as I hope some of you have encountered, had a specialty. He was a knight, a great captain of Charlemagne, and he was to go around cleaving Saracens. That's about the same as hitting home runs, you know. He would smite one mightily. Well, that's what Babe Ruth used to do. That's what Roger Maris did. That's the cult of mucho hombre, if you like, and it's always a physically satisfying thing to experience. Well, his specialty was one that I've always been enthralled by. On good days, when he clave, is that the past tense? When he clave a Saracen on the top knot with his sword, the stroke would carry right down through. And if he was in really good form, one half the Saracen would fall off the horse on one side, and the other half would fall off on the other. Now, see, that's symmetry. And also, he was doing it for the pleasure of the act. Now, let's assume with Roland, I think it's a terrible premise if you want to change it, but let's assume with him that he did his Saracen cleaving for God, that God was being served in this. But if that is so, may I point out that God was sufficiently served as soon as the Saracen's head was split open. The rest of it, you see, was sheer bravura. It was for its own sake, for the pleasure of doing the thing better than perfectly, for making it come off, for the joy of seeing the form happen. It began with God, it ended in symmetry. And I think that's the way a poem has to mean. In this sense of any act of skill is an admirable thing. But you can't get too sensible about it, because any act of skill involves doing more things at once than there is time to think about entirely. That's why criticism is a limping thing. It comes behind a multiple action and tries to explain it one thing at a time. A pun is a perfect example of multiple language at work, you see. Supposing you say a devastatingly brilliant pun. The audience has to get, whoever is listening has to get both sides of it in the same instant. Multiplicity and simultaneity. It does no good to get one side of the pun now and the rest of it next week. That's too far apart. And of course, if somebody comes along and says, I don't get it, when you've just been brilliant, well, what do? Do you explain? You just revise your guest list the next time and don't ask this person. And in a sense, the poets have been doing just that. They're not going to talk to the politicians. The politicians use another kind of language. And who wants to make up his multiplicities only in order to have them explained? Any act of skill involves doing more things at once than there is time to think about. That's not only in poetry, it's in everything. Walking across the room is an act of skill. If you had to think each step of it, you'd fall down. Or can you think, for example, when you tied your shoelace this morning? Now, if you watch a small child trying to tie his shoelace, you see how complicated an act it is. He studies it painfully, tries to get the threads one thing at a time, and finally ends up with a mess. But this occurred to me one morning when I was looking out the window. There was a cardinal in a little hemlock tree outside the window, and he'd stayed with us one winter, this last year, and it was about time for him to make up his mind whether to stay or go, and I was wondering whether he was going to stay. And I was talking to my wife in the next room and tying my shoelace all at the same time when my son came in and said, "Daddy, help me with my shoelace." Well, I wasn't being terribly skillful, but I was doing three things at once without thinking about them. Well, poetry has to do 20 things at once, if you like. And if you go hammering at it as meaning, it's lost. Because you want this engagement. Take this little poem. I think it's a sweet one. I hope some of you have been studying the sonnet. Witter Binner, some 30-odd years ago, wrote one of the most marvelously clever trick sonnets I've ever come on. It's a skeletal sonnet, only 14 words in it, 1 word per line. And all he's doing is using the rhyme scheme of the sonnet. Now, if you set off to pull off this trick, you see, you have certain things to bear in mind. I don't think he thought about them all the way. They were just buried in him the way knowing how to tie your shoelaces is buried into your fingers, because you've done it so often. He had the feel for it. And how do you paraphrase that kind of feel? He was arguing that he began the sonnet. Now, if you write a sonnet, he took an A-B-B, A-A-B-B-A rhyme scheme, divided it at 8 lines, and then had 6 lines. Now, sonnets often run question and answer, and he has his question in the first 8 words, his answer in the last 6. He has preserved the division, the form of the sonnet, and the tone. That's the sweet part of it. You see, it sounds like a sonnet question. And the poem is called An Aeronaut to His Love. It goes this way, you can see it. I, through blue sky, fly to you. Why? Sweet love, feet move so slow. I think it's a very sweet sonnet question. It's a marvelous sonnet. I've tried for years to duplicate, find 14 words that would do that sort of thing. Now, supposing, under the force of paraphrase, you had written to the girl and sent her a telegram saying, walking too slow, I'm flying love. What's lost? You see, what's gone out of the poem? All of those things, the love of the sonnet form, the balance of 8 lines against 6, the tone of the question, and so forth. These are all lost values, and those are the poem. It's not the message. That poem is not equivalent to I am flying to you because it is too slow to walk. That's no poem. See, now note another thing. The poem goes, I through blue sky fly to you. Pause. Why? Then a big pause. Big silence. Sweet love, feet move so slow. And the rhythm changes. It just descends one way or another. Let me read you a poem that I think does a marvelous job of shifting its rhythm in response to what the poem is doing. Here's one by Robert Graves, if I can find it. I sometimes can. I just want you to note the strategy of the rhythm in this thing. It's a fascinating title, The Traveler's Curse After Misdirection. Well, you've got a situation, you see. Certainly there's no need to explain that situation. But what is important is how successfully rhythmic he makes this curse. So much so that I'm sure that by the time he has finished the poem, he loves the people who misdirected him, because they gave him such a good opportunity. But watch this. It starts with a kind of staccato rhythm for a few lines. Very regular, very even beat. That's establishing a rhythmic base. It's like laying down the beat. Then he varies it for a bit, relaxes it, and then begins to build rhythmically to a climax. You listen for it. This is what you cannot paraphrase. May they wander stage by stage, and you see what that repetition does and how hard the that's emphasis too. You know. It's a spitting damn word. Stage. May they wander stage by stage of the same vain pilgrimage, stumbling on age after age, night and day, mile after mile. And now he begins to vary it. At each and every step, a style. At each and every style, with all, may they catch their feet and fall. At each and every fall they take, may a bone within them break. And you see the boom, boom, bang, may a bone within them break. And may the bones that break within not be for variation's sake, now rib, now thigh, now arm, now shin, but always, without fail, the neck. You see, if I run into Robert Graves again, I'll tell him you like his poem. I think it's a lovely, happy experience. Just that moving upward and upward and upward of the rhythm. It's something to go with. And there's basically how a poem means, really. There's one other thing I should say. It's an experience, and I want to get to talking about poetry as experience. But there's another thing. Students in the humanities, if you take the humanities seriously, some of you, I'm sure, are going to turn out to be teachers, and that's a good thing to be. But you have no right to go into the teaching profession unless you have already made up your minds that it is a bookish and an intellectual life. I have taught teachers, and I am sick and tired of teachers who do not read books. If you're going to be a teacher, be a good one. But that means using the library. It means not only what you read, but how movingly you read it as an experience. Because if you cannot get experiences out of reading, then for heaven's sake, go teach home economics or physical training or something that doesn't require this. These are all valuable disciplines, but stay out of the English classroom. You're only going to be lousing it up. And there are enough loused up classrooms now, which is probably really why Johnny can't read. But see, teachers are categorizers. This is my little sermon for the morning. A lot of them are. You will discover this too. If you're having trouble getting your education in the regular school year, don't worry about it. Just take summer school courses. Nobody flunks summer school courses. The standards go to pieces when the teachers come in. This is not a happy statement. I simply make it from experience. I have taught summer school, and I have found that I could not enforce in the same courses the standards I would require of a normal undergraduate class, not unless I was prepared to flunk 90% of the class, and that would have created a political furor. That's a racing tip, you know. If you can't do it honestly, be shrewd about it. How to get through without being actually illegal. But the fault I have found in teachers in the humanities is that they want categorical answers. They want to be told the purpose of life is, the meaning of a poem is, the goals of philosophy are. And if you give them 8 goals of philosophy, they'll memorize them and they'll give them back to you. They'll misspell some of it, but in essence, they'll get some of it back to you. You cannot function that way in the humanities. Here's the way the categorizer goes. I had this run with teachers only 2 summers ago. We got to work on, we were using a textbook of mine, and one of the examples that came up was the difference between 2 phrases, gather ye rosebuds while ye may, and make hay while the sun shines. Now, we had been discussing metaphor, so that they knew that when you say, gather ye rosebuds while ye may, that doesn't mean, Henry, go out and cut me a centerpiece and be quick about it while you may, you know, because company's coming. They knew it was not a literal statement. They knew it was metaphor. It meant something else. And by a great effort of the imagination, they could see that this meant something such as, seize the day, for it is fleeting. Or a carpe diem, if that had elementary Latin. Whatever enters into the thing. So we got to make hay while the sun shines. And they knew that that was not an agricultural directive. They could see that was a metaphor. But again, the categories came in like steel traps and intellect stopped. It also means seize the day, for it is fleeting. And therefore, since they both mean the same thing, as they learned in geometry, 2 things equal to a third thing are equal to each other, and therefore gather ye rosebuds while ye may is the same thing as make hay while the sun shines. Well, I tried and tried with those teachers to try to point out the difference in tonality and overtone and flavor of the 2 phrases. I pointed out to them that I Dream of Jeannie with the Light Brown Hair is a love song about a girl. Sweet Bessie from Pike, who crossed the wide prairie with her lover Ike, is also a love song about a girl of a sort, but in a very different tonality, with about as much difference as there is, say, between Ophelia and the Wife of Bath. I pointed out, for example, that you could sing all the stanzas of Jeannie with the Light Brown Hair in company where it would be unwise to sing all the stanzas of Sweet Bessie from Pike. None of that seemed to make any difference, and then I had a moment's inspiration. I said, look, I haven't quite reached that stage, but if you find yourself the parent of a teenage daughter, and some stolid young oaf comes to call with his eyes gleaming, you have it as a principal occupation to discover whether he is gathering rosebuds or making hay. Is that difference enough? Now, these differences in words do exist, and if you cannot respond to them, Maybe you're metaphorically deaf. Maybe poetry is not for you. If, for example, you do not know how a man feels, approximately how he feels, when he says, as J. Alfred Prufrock does in the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, I should have been a pair of ragged claws scuttling across the floors of silent seas. Now that doesn't say I feel such and such. But if you cannot feel how a man feels when this thought is in his mind, then just give up the thought of reading poetry. It's not for you. You're metaphorically tone deaf. Just as being tone deaf destroys music for you, and just as being colorblind is going to limit your entrance into painting, in the same way, if seriously you do not have a sense of how a man feels at that point, I should have been a pair of ragged claws scuttling across the floors of silent seas. That's hardly on Wisconsin, it's a different emotion from it. And you've got to be able to identify those emotions, because what is involved here is not meaning, but experience. A poem is an experience. Now, that experience may have some overt meaning, but there are many great poems, truly great poems in the English language, whose meaning has defied every effort. There are passages in the Bible that will live forever as human resonances. What's the meaning of the book of Job? Now, you can argue that back and forth forever. But it lets out a kind of human resonance that tells you this is one of the joining points of human memory. This is one of the articulations of the race. And you need to be present in that articulation. I don't know what Kubla Khan means, but it stays with me. It's an experience. You've read Kubla Khan, I've read Kubla Khan. We can discuss it as if we had been to some mysterious place together. Now, I don't know what Niagara Falls means, but if we've both been there, we can talk about the power of that water as it goes over. I don't know the meaning of that power, but it's something that haunts and stays with you. I don't know what Blake's Tiger, Tiger, Burning Bright means, except in a general way. I don't know what Walter de la Mare's The Listeners means, except in a general way. I'm almost completely befuddled by Shakespeare's The Phoenix and the Turtle. That is, I'm befuddled when I find myself paying attention to the details, and when I slide over the details, I think I know where I'm going. It's a very strange experience that way. The same with Tiger, Tiger, Burning Bright. They're not meanings, they're experiences, like shivering symbols of experience. I sometimes find myself thinking of my wife in these terms, I don't know what she means half the time, but she's some experience, and I wouldn't be without it. It's true, that many of the things of our lives will not be stated overtly, will not be put down into 2 or 3 good English sentences that make sense. I used to have a colleague at Harvard, and every time he got drunk, or I shouldn't say it that way. He was an English professor, so I'll say every time he grew reminiscent. Is that the better way? Every time he grew reminiscent, he would think back to his second marriage. He'd had 4 of them. Just bad luck, I guess. But for some reason, that second one, which lasted just less than 6 or 7 months, whatever it was the one that came to him in his reminiscent mood. And he would say, I've heard him say a number of times, I still don't know what experience that was, but it was some experience. He was trying to sort it out. And let's face it, some of the most meaningful things you do are not going to be stated overtly in 3 sentences that make sense. Some of you, all of you, most of you are going to fall in love. And what's the meaning of that experience? And it will be different from time to time. You will give yourself simple statements about it because you've been conditioned to have. Maybe it's Maybe what the literateurs claim is true, that people would not fall in love had they not read about it. Maybe our society creates the context in which people fall in love and sets the tone for it. But you find yourself batting in a happy fog, and you wouldn't be outside it. But what does it mean? My daughter had a sure sense of that. You see, the critics come along and begin asking hard questions. Hickory dickory dock, the mouse ran up the clock struck one, and down he run, and however it goes. Now, if he ran up the clock, the chances that was a grandfather clock. And is that a Freudian symbol? I don't resist the question. It's one possible question to ask in one possible content. Or how about one? Why did it strike one? That's number one, ego. That's the beginning of a new day. Is that part of it? What you see, you puzzle at these questions forever. But I think they're extrinsic to the poem. Take another difficult one. At age 2, my daughter knew exactly what this poem meant. One misty, moisty morning, when cloudy was the weather, I chanced upon an old man clothed all in leather. He began to compliment, and I began to grin. How do you do? And how do you do? And how do you do again? That was it. So you get to the last line, and you say, how do you do? And how do you do? And how do you do again? And then you giggle. And I think that's a lovely meaning. As I say, I've been writing children's poems, and I'd love to write a poem that would have little girls bowing to the east and bowing to the west and bowing to the one that they love best and then giggling. I think that would be a sumptuous meaning. I'd rather write that poem than all of Carl Sandburg, for example. I'd rather write that poem than half of William Wordsworth. I said half. The other half I'll hold out for. Because you see, that's a human thing. It latches onto the nervous system and makes it go. And poetry is that. Talk about it on the surface all you want. There's only one final measure of poetry. Memorable poems stick to human memory, and other poems get forgotten. I think the school system has to be blamed also for keeping a number of intensely forgettable poems alive under forced pressure. But that's a problem that will resolve itself in time. Even this will pass away. But you see, what you're dealing with is not meaning, it's experience. Now let me tell you something about how this goes in experience. Because this is both on the nature of reading and it's a sermon on the humanities. Note the difference between that sacred academic ritual called the freshman theme and say, a short story or a novel. Expository writing is written paragraph by paragraph. You try to teach the kids to frame something called intelligent generalizations, sometimes called topic sentences, and then you discuss at great length the presentation, the orderly and sufficient presentation of reasoning or evidence in support of a generalization, sometimes called paragraph development. And you try to do this paragraph by paragraph as you go, and it's a discipline I intend to respect. But if you are writing a novel, you do not write it paragraph by paragraph. You write it scene by scene, with a little transitional stuff in between maybe, but essentially it is scene by scene. If you will begin to study the nature of a scene, you'll see that there's one overwhelming characteristic, one first characteristic from which you cannot escape. And that is the fact that in every scene there is one and only one means of perception. It may be the author himself, usually it is a character. You identify the means of perception without thinking about it, but he or she is the character to whose inner workings the author has access. When a conversation is going, it doesn't say, Fred said, let's get out of here. He was thinking such and such and such and such. Joe said, I don't think I'm ready to go. He was thinking such and such and such and such and such. What are you talking about, said Fred. He had it in the back of his mind that so-and-so and so-and-so. No, that's not a scene in fiction. You're lost. Because the means of perception is the character with whom you identify. You become that character. It's as if you become that character. Now, I think a life in the humanities is a matter of learning to identify with every sort of character. Somebody said to E. E. Cummings once, "What about the world, Mr. Cummings?" And he said, "I live in so many. Which one?" If you're living in that world, you may make a rotten bank teller. You may be counting in one world what your hands are holding in another and get all confused. But for the humanities, I don't think there is any other way. You have to have these multiple worlds going around you. Now, what's involved here is empathy. Empathy. E-M-P-A-T-H-Y. From two basic Greek roots. M-E-M is in, and P-A-T-H-O-S, pathos is feeling, feeling into, empathy. Now, there's nothing remote about empathy. When I was a kid, any Saturday afternoon when I could scrounge the money, I was at the movies empathizing at the top of my lungs with 3,000 other young savages. You identified with the hero. You hissed the villain. The perils of Pauline were current at this point. And when Pauline came staggering out of some adventure, she went through some horrendous things. But she always escaped with a whole skin. Incidentally, she always got her dress slightly torn. The skin stayed whole, but the dress got torner and torner, as my son would say. I guess that was part of her characterization. Well, here's this attractive blonde in a slightly torn dress, running through perils. And one of the standard ones was that she'd find herself in the dark corridor of an abandoned castle with cobwebs, a sort of Dracula place. And she'd be backing around it in terror, standing this way and looking around. They used to act in those days. But she'd pause by a wall, and a door would slide open silently, and a great hairy arm would reach out. And we'd all say, "Look out!" And she'd step away. And the hairy arm. That's empathy, you see. Nobody ever said, "Get her hairy arm." We weren't conditioned for that one. But now, may I point out, if some of you are Charles Addams fans, as I am, that Charles Addams made a career of shouting for the hairy arm. He switched the identification, you see. Now, that's not hard to do. It isn't. You could write the story in such a way that the audience sympathized with the hairy arm. You see, a little tear-jerking. That was this poor, orphaned, hairy arm that had to live in dank castle walls, and it would look out of the chinks in the stoneworks and see blondes in slightly torn dresses flitting by, and it wanted one of its own. And why be a hairy arm if you can't have a blonde in a slightly torn dress? And but every time, it would wait years, centuries maybe, with a witch's spell upon it. And every time the blonde got close enough so that he could open his sliding door and reach out, everybody in the world shouted, "Look out!" And she's dead. And the hairy arm had to pull itself back into the castle works, you see, and go on being sad and lonely. Well, the point I'm trying to make is really a serious one, even if you just have to take my word for it. You can be made to identify with anything if you're a willing reader. And it's only by extending your identifications in this way that you get to be a human being. I think you have to identify with Homer, you have to identify with Dante, you have to identify with Virgil, you have to identify with Job on the dung heap, you have to identify with Sophocles on the terrace stabbing his eyes out, you have to identify with Ophelia and Cleopatra and the wife of Bath and so on, before you have a sense of what's going on, because what every piece of writing is about is a specimen of mankind. It's a specimen human experience. And where are you going to get these things? How many Shakespeares are there in your dormitory? the chances are you'll do better. If you're looking for Shakespeare, you'd do better to look for him in the library, to get him vicariously, to get the experience of Shakespeare. Now, along the way, there will be overt meanings, but that experience is first. That's how it means. You have to live what is being written about. You have to live it inside yourself vicariously, on the clock, or you're lost. I don't know any other way to get to be a human being, but there's one thing to be said in its favor. I think it's rather fun to try being a human being. It's much more fun than some of the occupations that are better respected. In any case, I recommend it to you. I've got to run. Thank you very much.